Two core fundamental skills in science are reading and writing, because we have to communicate about our science through the written word. And there are lots of different ways of writing about science. We can read about science in a newspaper, we can read about it in a journal, like in a magazine like New Scientist, in a journal like Nature that comes out every week and is aimed across the whole of the sciences, or a more specialist journal like this one, New Phytologist, which just covers one particular discipline of science. And all of these different publications have different ways of writing about science. So in a newspaper, for example, you'll have a very simple headline that tries to summarise the topic, and then the first paragraph will give you a broad summary of what has been discovered. And a newspaper article is designed so that you can stop reading at any point and still know what happened. You don't have to read right to the end to get the punchline. And so newspaper articles are a really good user-friendly way of writing about science. You can get more detail by reading more of the article, but when you get bored you can immediately stop and you still know what it was about. As a scientist, I always want to know, well, what's the source of the information? And in a good newspaper article, if it's reporting a new bit of science that's just been published in a scientific journal, they would normally tell you the name of the journal it was published in, and so you can go away and search the latest issue of that journal and find the paper. But that's normally the only reference you'll get, of course, in a newspaper article. You won't have a long bibliography of all their sources, but you will have a hint of where to look for more information if it's a good newspaper. And that's invaluable to us as a scientist trying to keep on top of science in the news. Now, a magazine like New Scientist will have rather longer articles than a newspaper covering a scientific topic, and they'll tend to have a few more references, and they'll be a bit clearer about where the research was done and who did it. They'll often start off with a very striking sentence to try to grab the attention of the reader. So here's an article about mass extinctions. Starts off with a question: should the big five be the big four? And so on. Tries to grab the reader, and everything is written in a very simple, user-friendly way that's as exciting as possible. A journal like Nature or like Science is aimed at a scientific readership, but it tries to be non-disciplinary. It tries to present science in such a way that whatever your discipline, you can understand what happened, or at least you can get a bit of an impression of what happened. Papers in Nature or Science are actually incredibly difficult to read, even if you are in that scientific area. And that's partly because once you get past the summary, which tries to set things in a broad context, the rest of the article is a mix of methods and results. And you have to read through very carefully. It does follow a logical sequence, but so much information is being packed into such a small space that articles in Nature and Science can be very difficult to follow and very difficult to understand. And often they'll be accompanied by online information, which is often much, much longer than the article itself. So whilst they're exciting and interesting, articles in Science and Nature are actually pretty tricky to get to grips with. Papers in a specialist journal like this one, New Phytologist, which just publishes plant science, tend to be longer, and superficially they look more technical than a paper does in Nature or Science, but in fact they're often much, much easier to follow. And they tend to publish two different types of paper. One is a review paper, where a scientist or a group of scientists review a scientific topic and cite lots of different papers that recently and in the past have contributed to that topic, and they try to bring everything together into a larger synthesis. These papers often explain things relatively simply, and they're a very good way in to a research topic. So if there's a research area that you want to begin to understand, find a review paper that's been written for a specialist journal, and that will often give you a very good entry point into that field of research. And then of course the bread and butter of scientific research is the standard research paper in a specialist journal that classically have a format where there's a summary, an abstract at the beginning, followed by an introduction, then methods, then results, then a discussion. Or perhaps the titles of those different areas will be slightly different, but the general pattern of how they're written is almost always the same. And they'll have lots and lots of references and lots of figures illustrating the results that the scientists have in their particular study. Now, a rookie error when you come to an article like that is that you have to read every single word of the article. You don't have to. The way to approach them is to start off by reading the abstract. The abstract will give you a good high-level summary of what the paper's saying, and you can decide once you've read the abstract whether you're interested to read that paper or not. It might be that actually it's not something you're interested in. Thousands and thousands of scientific papers get published every year. We can't possibly read all of them, and sometimes, the majority of the time, once we've read the abstract, that's all we might read. However, if we decide this is a paper that I'm interested to read and will tell me something very valuable, I then start to look in more detail. Now, if it's an area that you're quite new to, you'll probably need to read the whole of the introduction. And that will not only help you understand that paper, but understand the research area. An introduction is like a mini review, but focused on the questions that the authors are asking. At the end of the introduction, in a good paper, the final paragraph will be another summary of what the paper does. Quite often it will start with the word here, comma, here we show, or here we do this experiment or that experiment. And that paragraph is really useful for telling you where the paper's headed. Normally we then flick to the results, and I'll normally start the results by looking at the figures that the authors have published and the figure legends, just to get an overview of what they actually did. And if that looks interesting, then I'll read the results section in more detail. Then I'll go to the conclusions and see what they've concluded from their results. And if there's something that strikes me as a bit surprising, or I think, well, I'm not sure that's supported by their results, I'll then want to go back and have a look in more detail. And then if there's something I really want to follow up and really want to understand, I'll probably go back and look at the methods a little bit more, just to really understand what they did. The more established you get in a field, the more familiar you'll become with the methods that are used in your area and with the general literature in your area. And so the less and less do you need to read some of the sections of papers, and the more you can focus on what is really new. But when you're starting out, you will have to read a lot more than you will once you become a bit more established. The bibliography of a paper is very important as well, because when you're new to an area, the bibliography will highlight for you other papers that you should be reading. And when you're more established in an area, it might point out to you some new papers that have been published that perhaps you weren't aware of before. So if I'm reading a paper in any detail, I will normally at least have a glance through the whole of the bibliography just to see which papers are cropping up and if there's anything new that I haven't seen before.